the South African Broadcasting Corporation News will celebrate its 75th anniversary tomorrow. And the public broadcaster aired its first news bulletin on radio in 1950. And the SABC was established in 1936 as a broadcaster. But to help us reflect on the reporting of SABC News, adhering to its public broadcaster editorial codes, we joined in studio by Media Monitoring Africa's director, William Bird. William, thanks so much for coming through. I was saying to you off air, it feels like we've grown up together in this space.
Well, yeah, considering our organisation was started just ahead of the 94 elections to monitor how SABC was going to cover this, because, of course, until that, they had been known as as part of the deep state, legitimately the propaganda arm of the Nationalist Party government. And even before then, if you go back to it, television particularly was resisted by the then Nationalist Party because they saw it as this thing that could bring in evil, lascivious values. It was going to assist in Satanism being spread throughout the land and in people getting all sorts of wild liberation ideas and in, communists coming and taking over. And then they started to see that actually this could be an incredibly powerful tool to help keep these pesky black people who kept on demanding rights and all these kinds of things, and it was a very useful tool for them to exercise very draconian and revolting forms of power. It was common for SABC to accompany news, to accompany SAPS on raids when they were looking for ANC operatives and the like, and then they'd go in and burst into their homes with the TV cameras there, that kind of gross invasion of people's dignity and privacy at times, and that kind of continued through. It's been a wild ride, but we certainly in an infinitely better place today than we were then. Indeed
we are, and I suppose one of the unintended consequences of that is the archive material, the rich archive material we have of some of that brutality that was actually captured. And then, William, you speak of those dark old days when the state president used to call, every day in terms of what was on the news, what was put on. So something like editorial independence was unheard of.
Yeah, it was seen purely as a state broadcaster and as a function of government's ability to disseminate and make sure that they were putting out Nationalist Party ideology almost exclusively. And then there were sort of pockets of people trying to do different things in the SABC, and you started to get this fracturing where, because its services started to grow, in African language services, even though there was clear lines being taken, there were little elements of resistance that people were starting to exercise, because of course African languages were treated as the very distant cousin, the one that no one likes but has to kind of be there, a useful tool in order to try and tell blacks that everything was fine and that you didn't need to worry, the Nationalist Party had your best interests at heart, even though they were denying you your basic fundamental rights. So it was a crazy kind of period of our history. But I think what's so important about it is that it's like our constitutional court. It's built on the grounds of a place where there was so much oppression and violation of people's dignity and fundamental rights. At SABC, this 75 years, 45 years of that period was not something we're proud of. But these are things that make us who we are. This is a state broadcaster that we've transitioned to become a legitimate and one of the most credible public broadcasters, certainly on the continent.
And even then, it wasn't easy. Old habits die hard. We saw the transition, but you've had a front row seat to the transition and, of course, what has happened here. Let's talk about editorial policy at the SABC and how that has changed, especially post-94.
So it was really interesting. You started to see this idea that all people had rights. It was quite a new thing, even though the SABC was being run in a very different way. So one of the early things that we saw, for example, was it was still common practice for black people especially, and almost exclusively, for them, when they'd lost a loved one, for the camera to be right up in their face, to be saying, you know, how does it feel having had your daughter just killed in front of you, or whatever the case was. And that was a legitimate exercise, even though now we would look at that and go, what are you doing? You know, this person's in a state of trauma, and there's not a news legitimate angle to that. This is an invasion of privacy. This is kind of emotional trauma porn, if you like. And seeing it move from there to the editorial policies that we have today at the SABC, which are easily among the best, editorial policies with any public broadcaster anywhere in the world. So we've moved from that place of extreme and egregious rights violations to having policies and standards that are really, world class. But of course, as you point out, that road has been bumpy, and it remains bumpy, to be clear. You know, you had a very dark period under Hlari Motsoeneng, where there was a very clear, deliberate effort to directly control the SABC and the news narrative. There was a clear idea that it was going to be run in a very particular way, and it was going to serve again as the propaganda arm, effectively, of the ANC at that point. And then very many brave people, yourself included in one of those, stood up and said, we're not going to tolerate this now. We're not going back to that kind of broadcaster. And we are now in a place where the SABC is there. There's a lot to commend it, and there's also a lot that I'm frankly terrified about, because it's eking out an existence. It's grossly underfunded, and it's still being seen as a political football, and something that, some within government think that they need to control.
And so important, had a conversation with the minister yesterday about the funding model, and the fact that everybody knows that the funding model of the SABC and servicing the public mandate is not fit for purpose, and yet we just carry on as if, this thing will resolve itself. But a conversation for another day. That I also want to talk to you about very important work that SABC has done in the development of its editorial policy and persona when it comes to the reporting of children in the media. And you were right there, very instrumental in that, in developing that sort of consciousness with us, William.
So I think that there are a few fundamental shifts in the editorial policies that we've seen since 2000, where you started to get respect for people's fundamental rights, that imbuing, if you like, of dignity and equality that comes directly from our Constitution into the editorial policies. And now we seem to take that for granted. But that was quite a revolutionary thing for the SABC to do, because it spoke about dignity and equality and bringing that real sense of Ubuntu into what it means to be a public broadcaster, which is really a lovely, lovely thing. And the moment you take that as your point of departure, you go from that of dignity and equality, dignity when people are going through extreme grief and distress, seeing their loved ones, murdered or whatever the case is, to respecting the rights of our most marginalized children, especially at times when they are even more vulnerable. And that was about saying, if we're going to be a public broadcaster and respect people's rights and try and talk about social cohesion, we have to make sure that in all these respects, we protect and respect things like children's rights. We talk about gender inequality, how we're going to cover gender-based violence, how we're going to deal with, South Africa's biggest challenges. And recognizing that and seeing that shift really does take us so far away from this horrible, despicable beast of a thing that we were born with in 1976 when it came on air to what it is today.
Well, William, there's so much we could talk about, but we'll have to leave it there for today. And I think, as William says, there's so much that we take for granted today, but at the time when those things were being weaved into the policy direction, it was actually groundbreaking. William Bird, a Media Monitoring Africa Director, reflecting with us here about SABC News and, of course, reporting of the SABC News over the years.